Everyone believed the billionaire's only son was born with a rare and fatal type of leukemia. For years, he was kept isolated, surrounded by doctors, needles, and endless treatments, until one day a new maid arrived at the mansion. She noticed small details that no one else ever questioned, and what she discovered shocked everyone. The truth had been hidden all along, and it was far more disturbing than anyone could imagine. Before we continue with this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Oh, and don't forget to comment below where you're watching us from. We love to know that. Richard's life changed completely the day his wife died during childbirth. From that moment on, he became a different man, quiet, distant, and cold. Even though he had more money than most people could imagine, none of it could bring his wife back or heal the pain he felt. Their son, Arthur, was born that same day, but instead of feeling joy, Richard only felt emptiness. Every time he looked at Arthur, all he could see was the woman he lost. The baby's cries echoed through the large mansion, but Richard rarely held him or stayed in the same room. He left everything to the nannies and doctors. What should have been a happy moment became a constant reminder of loss. The house was big and full of expensive things, but it felt more like a museum than a home. There were no warm dinners, no laughter, just silence and memories that Richard couldn't erase. Arthur was not a healthy baby. From the beginning, doctors gave Richard bad news. Arthur had leukemia. Even though he was just a baby, he had to go through painful treatments. Richard hired the best doctors and paid for the most advanced hospitals. Private nurses stayed with Arthur around the clock. No expense was too big, but Richard never showed real love. He thought that by spending money, he was doing everything a father should. But Arthur didn't need money. He needed affection. Richard visited him only when necessary, and even then, he barely spoke. His eyes never softened, and his arms remained closed. Arthur grew up surrounded by machines and medicine, not bedtime stories or hugs. Richard never read to him, never played with him, and never smiled at him. It was as if Arthur was just another responsibility, not his own son. The distance between them grew deeper every day, even though they lived under the same roof. Richard's mansion was enormous and filled with the best things money could buy. There were chandeliers in every room, marble floors, paintings worth millions, and staff that kept everything spotless. But all of that meant nothing because the house was cold. There were no signs of family, no photos on the walls, no toys in the living room. Arthur had a nursery with everything a child could want. Custom furniture, soft blankets, and high-tech monitors, but he rarely left his crib. The silence in the mansion was louder than any sound. Meals were eaten alone, holidays passed without celebration. No visitors came, and Richard avoided making new connections. He believed that showing emotion would make him weak. The staff followed his lead, always formal, always distant. Over time, even they stopped trying to break the ice. The mansion became a place of routines and sadness. Every day felt the same, and nobody dared to speak about the past. Though Richard spent millions trying to save Arthur, the boy's condition didn't improve. Each new treatment brought hope, but the results were always the same. Nothing worked. Doctors tried to explain, but Richard rarely listened. He wasn't interested in the details. He just wanted results. When one hospital failed, he moved on to the next. He flew specialists from around the world, paid for experimental drugs, and remodeled parts of the house into medical wings. But none of it brought Arthur peace or relief. The boy cried often, his body weak, his spirit fading. Richard told himself he was buying time, but what he was really doing was avoiding the truth. He didn't want to face the idea of losing another person. So he kept spending, believing money could fix anything. But Arthur didn't smile, didn't laugh, and barely spoke. He lived in pain, with no comfort from the one person who should have been closest to him. Arthur's caregivers did their best, but they couldn't fill the space left by a distant father. Nurses held his hand, read him stories, and tried to bring light into his world. But none of them could replace Richard. The boy asked for his father sometimes, quietly, with a tired voice. When Richard did appear, it was usually just to ask the doctors questions or to approve another expensive treatment. He never stayed long. Arthur learned to stop asking. Over time, he grew used to the loneliness, thinking maybe that was normal. The walls of the house were high, and so were the emotional walls around Richard's heart. He believed he was doing what needed to be done, keeping his son alive. But what Arthur needed most wasn't another injection or new machine. He needed love, presence, and a father who saw him as more than a reminder of grief. But Richard remained closed off, frozen in his pain. In his mind, Richard had convinced himself that everything he did was for Arthur. He thought that providing the best medical care was enough. He believed that emotions would only make things worse, so he buried his feelings deep inside. But the truth was, he was scared. Scared to love someone again and lose them. So he kept Arthur at a distance, protecting his own heart while failing to protect his son's. He saw Arthur not as a child, but as a symbol of everything that went wrong. The mansion, once meant to be a family home, became a monument to sorrow. Each room reminded him of what he lost, and each hallway echoed with silence. He couldn't see that in trying to escape his pain, he was causing more of it. In the end, he didn't buy Arthur time, he only extended his suffering. And so, life inside the mansion continued, full of wealth, but empty of love. Mary arrived at the mansion carrying 2 suitcases in her hands, but much more weight on her shoulders. Her eyes were tired, and her heart felt heavy. She wasn't just starting a new job, she was trying to start a new life. Mary had grown up in a poor neighborhood where everything was a struggle. Nothing ever came easy, and every meal on the table meant someone had worked very hard for it. She had been used to fighting for everything she had, but none of those battles compared to what she had just gone through. A few weeks before arriving, Mary had lost her only child, a little girl, to leukemia. The pain was still fresh. She hadn't even packed up her daughter's room. There were still toys on the floor, clothes in the drawer, and drawings taped to the fridge. Now Mary was trying to move forward, even though her heart wasn't ready. She needed this job. The mansion looked impressive from the outside, but as Mary stepped inside, she noticed the coldness in the air. Everything was perfectly clean and organized, but there was no warmth. The walls were decorated with expensive paintings, and the floor shined like glass, but it didn't feel like a home. A man greeted her briefly. This was Richard, her new employer. He didn't smile or make eye contact. He simply pointed toward the hallway and told another staff member to show her around. To him, Mary was just another employee, someone paid to keep things running. There was no interest in her story, no question about how she was doing, and certainly no kindness. Mary didn't expect much, but the lack of emotion still surprised her. She followed the housekeeper silently, trying to hide the sadness on her face. She knew she couldn't afford to break down. She had to be strong, even if it meant pretending everything was fine. Mary's first few days were quiet. She cleaned rooms, folded clothes, and learned the routines of the house. The other workers were polite but kept their distance. No one talked much. Everyone seemed to move through the house like shadows, doing their jobs and disappearing. There was no laughter, no small talk, just silence. But the thing that caught Mary's attention the most was the boy, Arthur. She saw him for the first time while changing the sheets in a guest room. He was sitting in a wheelchair near a window, pale and fragile, with tired eyes. A nurse stood beside him, speaking softly. Mary froze for a second. The boy looked so much like her daughter in her final days, thin, weak, and full of sadness. Her heart ached, but she stayed quiet. She didn't want to draw attention to herself, but from that moment on, she couldn't stop thinking about him. something inside her had shifted. Each time Mary passed by Arthur, she felt a pull. At first, she kept her distance, not wanting to interfere or make anyone uncomfortable. But whenever she saw him alone or looking out the window, she felt the need to stay close, even if just for a moment. She noticed things that others seemed to ignore, like how Arthur rarely smiled or how he didn't speak unless spoken to. His room was filled with expensive equipment, but it felt more like a hospital than a child's bedroom. Mary started finding small ways to help, bringing him extra blankets when the room felt cold, leaving a small toy near his bedside, or gently adjusting his pillow when the nurse wasn't around. She didn't expect anything in return. In fact, Arthur barely noticed her at first, but Mary didn't mind. She wasn't trying to replace anyone or fix the situation. She just wanted to care. It came naturally. Mary often stayed awake at night thinking about her daughter. Her memories would come rushing back. Her laughter, her voice, the way she used to hold Mary's hand when scared. It was painful, but somehow, being in the mansion near Arthur gave her a strange kind of peace. Maybe it was because she saw in him what she had lost. Maybe it was because she felt like she had one more chance to give love, even if it wasn't to her own child. Richard still avoided her, barely acknowledging her presence unless it was work-related. He remained distant and cold, trapped in his own world of pain and silence. Mary didn't blame him. She could see that he was suffering in his own way. But while he stayed locked in his grief, she found strength by giving. Slowly, she began to see that her presence might matter here, even if no one said it out loud. Over time, something began to change. Mary didn't know if it was the routine or the quiet moments she spent near Arthur, but she felt different. She started waking up with purpose, not just obligation. She still cried sometimes when no one was watching, but those moments became less frequent. She didn't forget her daughter and never would, but being near Arthur gave her a reason to keep going. Even if he didn't speak much, even if he never knew her story, she felt a connection. Her actions were small, but they came from the heart. And although Richard hadn't softened, Mary noticed his eyes following her once or twice when she helped Arthur. He didn't say anything, but maybe he was beginning to see something too. Without realizing it, Mary had stepped into a story that wasn't hers, but that she now belonged to. The job she had accepted to survive was slowly becoming something more. Arthur had grown used to being alone. In his world, people came and went wearing white coats, asking questions, adjusting machines, and checking charts. None of them stayed long. They spoke in low, serious voices and barely looked him in the eyes. To Arthur, everyone was just another face, another stranger who didn't really see him. He didn't try to talk much. When people asked how he felt, he would nod or shake his head, never giving full answers. He didn't trust anyone to care. Over time, he learned to keep his thoughts to himself. He spent most of his days surrounded by toys he rarely played with. They sat in the corners of his room, untouched, like decorations. Arthur preferred to sit quietly, looking at the drawings he made or staring out the window. People said he was quiet because of his illness, but the truth was, he just didn't feel close to anyone. When Mary came into his life, Arthur didn't expect anything different. She was just another adult who worked in the house. At first, he ignored her like he ignored everyone else. He avoided eye contact and didn't respond when she said good morning. He figured she would lose interest eventually, like all the others. But Mary didn't give up. She didn't ask complicated questions or treat him like a problem to be solved. She simply sat nearby, folding clothes or dusting furniture, and sometimes told short stories while she worked. They weren't fancy stories, just simple ones about animals, food, or kids playing in parks. At first, Arthur only half listened, but after a few days, he started paying more attention. He still didn't talk, but he began to wait for her voice. Sometimes, he even stayed awake longer just to hear one more story. Mary never forced him to speak. She waited patiently. And slowly, Arthur's silence began to change. One afternoon, while Mary was putting books back on the shelf, Arthur finally spoke. His voice was small, and his words came out slowly. "I like to draw," he said. Mary stopped what she was doing and looked at him with a soft smile. "What do you like to draw?" she asked gently. Arthur shrugged at first, but then added, "Animals and space." That was all he said that day, but it was a big step. From that point on, their conversations started to grow. Arthur didn't speak much, but each day he shared a little more. He talked about his favorite colors, the kinds of cartoons he remembered watching, and the shapes he liked to draw. Mary never pushed him. She let him guide the pace. Some days he was quiet again, and that was okay. She stayed close, listening when he talked and simply being there when he didn't. Her presence was calm, not rushed. That made all the difference. As days passed, Arthur began to smile, something the nurses hadn't seen in a long time. He even laughed once when Mary made a joke about a cat that got stuck in a cereal box. It was a small laugh, but a real one. It surprised everyone, even Arthur himself. Mary noticed how his mood changed whenever they were together. He became less tense, less closed off. He asked her questions too, like if she had ever ridden a train or if she knew how to draw a dragon. Mary answered every question with care, even if the answers were simple. Arthur also started to draw again. At first, he made pictures of stars and rockets. Then, he drew animals and people, sometimes even a lady with brown hair and a kind face. Mary never asked who that lady was. She knew. And seeing his drawings made her chest feel heavy, but also full in a way she hadn't felt in months. Arthur slowly started to talk about his mother, not in full stories, but in pieces. He would say things like, "I think she liked music," or "I wish I knew what her voice sounded like." Mary always listened, never interrupting or trying to explain things he didn't ask. She knew he had never really known his mother, and everything he imagined about her came from what little he had been told. But these moments were important. They showed that Arthur was starting to trust her, enough to open the parts of his heart that hurt the most. Mary felt honored to be the one he shared with. At night, when she was alone in her small room in the mansion, she sometimes cried silently, not because she was sad, but because she was finally feeling connected to something again. Arthur reminded her so much of her own daughter, not just in looks, but in spirit. Helping him helped her heal. Mary and Arthur had formed a bond that neither of them expected. It wasn't built overnight, and it didn't rely on grand gestures. It came from small acts of care and patience, from shared moments with crayons and quiet talks about the sky. Arthur no longer seemed like the same boy who once avoided everyone. He looked forward to Mary's visits, waited by the door, and sometimes even prepared drawings to show her. His doctors noticed the change. They said he seemed brighter, more willing to engage, but what they didn't understand was that the biggest change came from feeling loved. For the first time in his life, Arthur didn't feel invisible. Mary gave him what no one else had: real attention, real connection. And in return, he gave her something too, a chance to love again. As they sat together, drawing side by side, neither of them felt alone anymore. Something real had started to grow between them. Over time, Mary began to notice things that didn't make sense. At first, she thought she was just overthinking or maybe comparing too much with what she had experienced with her own daughter. But the feeling kept growing. Arthur didn't seem like a child with late-stage leukemia. He had energy on some days, laughed, played with crayons, and showed signs of improvement. Of course, he still looked weak at times, but not in the way she remembered from the hospital rooms with her daughter. The symptoms didn't match: the severe fatigue, the unstoppable fevers, the infections, the pain that made even sleep impossible. Arthur didn't show any of that, yet every day he was given heavy medications, ones Mary remembered well. They had made her daughter sick to her stomach, caused her to lose her hair, and left her too tired to move. Arthur was taking the same drugs, but his reactions didn't match. Something was off. Mary started paying more attention. She watched how the nurses administered the medicine. They were always quick, quiet, and strangely secretive. They never left the vials or pills where others could see them for long. Whenever Arthur had a medical appointment inside the mansion, no one was allowed near the room. The doors were locked, and the sessions were kept private. Mary once tried to stay close, pretending to dust nearby, but she was politely told to go elsewhere. It wasn't just the secrecy, it was the lack of normal medical routines. No one discussed results. There were no charts left out, no updates given to anyone in the house. Mary found that strange. When her daughter had been sick, the doctors and nurses were open with everything, always explaining what was happening. But here, everything was behind closed doors. The more Mary watched, the more the worry inside her grew. Then there were the documents, or rather, the effort to hide them. One afternoon, while cleaning the office, Mary saw a folder on the doctor's desk. It was half open, and inside she noticed medical forms with Arthur's name on them. Before she could read more, a staff member walked in and quickly took the folder away, locking it in a drawer. Mary apologized and acted as if she hadn't seen anything, but from that day on, she paid close attention to that drawer. It was always locked. Not only that, but sometimes she noticed strange containers in the trash, bottles and packaging with no labels or with writing she couldn't understand. It wasn't normal. Hospitals had a specific way of handling medical waste, and this didn't look like it followed any of those rules. The more she saw, the more confused she became. She didn't understand everything yet, but she knew something wasn't right. Mary's memory of her daughter's illness came back in full detail. She remembered every stage, every symptom, every reaction to the treatments. She remembered how her daughter's skin became pale and sensitive, how her gums bled, how the infections became more frequent. Arthur had none of that. He still had color in his cheeks. He smiled. He even had an appetite. Some days he was a bit quiet or tired, but not in a way that matched leukemia. Mary knew this disease too well to mistake it. She knew what it looked like when a child was truly in pain and fighting for life. Arthur didn't look like he was fighting. He looked like a child being told he was sick when he wasn't, and the medicine, those harsh drugs, didn't seem to be helping or hurting. They just happened without visible effect. It made no sense. Mary's instincts as a mother began to take control. Her doubts became serious concerns. She didn't tell anyone how she felt. She knew that if she started asking questions too early, she might be fired, or worse, make things harder for Arthur. So Mary began observing everything carefully. She took mental notes of what pills were given and at what time. She kept track of how Arthur reacted afterward. She checked trash bins when no one was around. Once, she found a used syringe with no medical markings. Another time, she found a small box labeled in a language she didn't recognize. She couldn't open it, but she wrote down the letters she saw. Late at night in her room, she started searching online for anything that matched what she had seen. Some things didn't lead anywhere. Others made her feel even more uneasy. None of this matched normal cancer treatment protocols. Mary started to realize she wasn't just dealing with bad procedures. She might be looking at something intentionally hidden. Her mind wouldn't rest. The more she saw, the more the puzzle came together, and what she saw frightened her. She started walking through the mansion differently, not just as a housekeeper, but as someone trying to understand what was really going on. Every hallway, every locked drawer, every piece of medical equipment became a clue. She pretended not to notice things, but inside, she was connecting them all. She thought about Arthur, about his trust in her, and how he had started to smile again. She couldn't just ignore what she felt. The thought that someone could be harming him, even unknowingly, made her stomach turn. Mary knew she had to keep going carefully. She couldn't accuse anyone yet, but she also couldn't stay silent. Her past pain, her experience, and her growing bond with Arthur pushed her forward. No longer just a helper in the house, she was becoming something else entirely, a silent investigator. While cleaning the living room, Mary was down on her knees, dusting the lower shelves of a cabinet when Arthur walked in, holding something in his hand. "Mary," he said in a curious tone, "I found this behind the box in the hallway closet. Is it ketchup?" He raised a small plastic pouch filled with a thick red liquid. His face was calm, innocent, with no idea what he was holding. Mary froze. Her hands stopped moving, and for a few seconds she couldn't speak. She stood up slowly, walked over to him, and gently took the pouch from his hands. As soon as she saw it up close, she knew exactly what it was. It wasn't ketchup. It wasn't any kind of food. It was blood, real human blood, sealed in a clear medical bag. Mary's stomach turned. Her hands trembled slightly, but she hid it from Arthur. "Where exactly did you find this?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but inside she was panicking. Arthur pointed toward the hallway closet, explaining that the bag was tucked behind some boxes. He said he liked to explore sometimes when no one was looking, and this time he had found something strange. Mary nodded as he spoke, pretending not to be alarmed. She didn't want to scare him. She smiled a little and told him to go wash his hands while she took care of the pouch. As soon as he left the room, she examined the bag more closely. It had no hospital label, just a number written in black marker. It looked like the kind of sample used in lab tests. Mary had seen enough of them during her daughter's illness to recognize the signs. This was fresh blood, probably kept hidden on purpose. It didn't take her long to connect the dots. It explained so much: the secret medical exams, the locked drawers, the strange vials. It confirmed everything she had started to suspect. This wasn't just a case of poor medical care. It was something worse. Someone was fabricating Arthur's test results. If blood was being stored secretly in the house, and if real medical documents were being hidden, then there was a deliberate plan behind all of it. Arthur wasn't sick. Mary felt it in her bones before, but now she had proof. Her heart pounded as she thought back to the treatments Arthur had received. Strong chemotherapy drugs, restricted diets, isolation. He had spent his life thinking he was dying when he was never ill to begin with. Mary sat down, the bag still in her hands. Her throat tightened. She remembered how her daughter had truly suffered, how every treatment had left her weaker, how they had prayed for time. And now, this boy, this kind and gentle child, had been made to believe he was facing the same fate for no reason. It was a lie, a cruel, calculated lie. Mary knew that Arthur trusted her. He had started opening up, showing his drawings, talking about his dreams. He had come out of his shell, slowly, gently. He didn't deserve this. He deserved the truth. But how could she tell a child that everything he believed about his health might be fake? She couldn't just blurt it out. She had to think. First, she needed to hide the pouch somewhere safe. She wrapped it in a cloth and placed it in a box in her room, out of sight. Then she sat on her bed, thinking about what to do next. She knew she couldn't confront Richard yet. He was too guarded. And the staff wouldn't help. Most were either clueless or complicit. Mary realized that the responsibility now rested on her shoulders. She needed to gather more information, more proof. But at the same time, she needed to protect Arthur. She couldn't let this go on. He had to be saved from this lie. That evening, when she went to check on Arthur, he was drawing spaceships again. He looked up and smiled when he saw her. "Did you find out what that ketchup was?" he asked. Mary knelt beside him and smiled gently. "It wasn't ketchup," she said carefully. "But don't worry about it. Just something old someone left behind." Arthur accepted the answer easily, going back to his drawing without any more questions. He was too young to understand what was being done to him, and too trusting to think the people around him could lie. That's what broke Mary the most, his innocence. He was just a child who wanted to live, play, and love. But someone had stolen that chance from him by creating a prison of needles, pills, and fake diagnoses. Mary could no longer sit quietly. She had seen the truth now. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The lie was clear, and now she had a reason to fight him. Mary didn't sleep that night. She paced her room, reviewing every moment since she started working there. She thought about the locked drawers, the secret exams, the medical staff who never answered real questions. The blood bag was the final piece of the puzzle. She now had something real, something they couldn't deny or explain away. Her memories of her daughter were sharp in her mind. That pain had never gone away, but this wasn't just about loss anymore. This was about justice. Arthur was not sick. He had been made into a patient, and that was unforgivable. Mary began writing things down, dates, names, strange events, everything she could remember. She hid her notes in a separate box, away from the blood sample. Every detail could matter later. She was no longer just an employee. She had a mission now. The truth had to come out. As she looked at the box one last time before sunrise, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: purpose. Mary continued her quiet investigation around the mansion, trying to piece together how someone could lie so deeply about a child's health. After finding the blood sample and realizing Arthur was not truly sick, she knew she had to find out who was behind everything. She watched more closely, listened in on conversations, and paid attention to anything unusual. Eventually, she began noticing one name that kept appearing in small conversations, on folders, and in medical references: Helen. At first, Mary thought Helen might be another doctor or someone from the hospital, but one day she overheard a conversation between a staff member and a nurse that made everything clear. Helen was Richard's mother. Not only that, she was also a highly respected doctor in her field, known for her experience and leadership. But the more Mary learned about Helen, the more she saw that behind the polished image was someone dangerous and controlling. Mary remembered the first time she met Helen. The woman had arrived at the mansion with an air of confidence, dressed perfectly, walking as if she owned every room she stepped into. She spoke to the staff in a sharp, demanding tone, making it clear that she expected full control. Helen barely acknowledged Arthur, except to discuss his condition with medical terms that no one dared question. Mary stayed quiet during that visit, but she paid attention to every word. Helen didn't speak like a grandmother worried about her grandson. She spoke like a businesswoman overseeing a project. That's when things started to click. Mary realized that Helen wasn't just involved. She was the one directing everything. She controlled Arthur's fake treatments, hired the private nurses, and managed the paperwork. It was all part of a system she had built herself, and worse, Helen used her status as a doctor to hide the truth. No one doubted her because of her reputation. Mary began digging deeper. She found out that Helen owned several private clinics and labs across the country. These facilities were supposed to be for advanced treatment, but many were rarely visited by actual patients. When she searched the names online during her nights off, she discovered something even worse. Those clinics received large payments from anonymous donors, funds that Mary now believed came directly from Richard. It became clear that Helen was using Arthur's fake illness to move money. Every time Richard paid for a new treatment, the funds went through one of Helen's clinics. She was laundering money through her own grandson's supposed disease. It was cruel, calculated, and heartless. Mary could hardly believe it. She remembered Richard's cold behavior and realized he was just a pawn in his mother's plan. Helen kept him in fear, dependent on her knowledge and control. Mary saw now that this wasn't just about greed, it was about power. What made Helen so dangerous was her ability to pretend. She had built a perfect public image, respected, admired, even celebrated in the medical community. People trusted her without question. That made it nearly impossible for someone like Mary, a housekeeper with no formal authority, to challenge her. But Mary knew what she had seen. She knew the truth about Arthur, and she now understood Helen's motives. By keeping Arthur sick, Helen kept Richard emotionally weak and financially tied to her. Richard's guilt over his wife's death made him easy to manipulate. He believed Helen's every word, especially when it came to medical advice. Mary thought about how long this had been going on. Arthur had never lived a single day free of this lie. It was more than manipulation. It was emotional imprisonment. Helen's arrogance made it clear that she believed no one would ever catch on. That was her weakness. She underestimated people like Mary. Even though Mary was afraid, she felt something stronger pushing her forward, her bond with Arthur. He trusted her, confided in her, and depended on her presence. She couldn't turn her back now. She couldn't allow Helen to continue controlling that child's life. Arthur deserved to know the truth. He deserved a chance at a real life, not one shaped by lies and fear. Mary knew she was just a maid in the eyes of the powerful, but she didn't care. Her past had already prepared her for difficult battles. She had faced the real pain of illness with her daughter. She had held a dying child in her arms and watched helplessly as medicine failed. Now, with Arthur, she had the chance to protect another child from being hurt. That gave her strength. Mary knew Helen was powerful, but she also knew the truth was on her side, and that meant something. Mary started planning. She began documenting everything: dates, names, transactions, conversations. She kept her records hidden in a locked box and slowly built a case, one detail at a time. She knew it wouldn't be easy to expose Helen. The woman had friends in high places and a reputation most people wouldn't dare question. But Mary didn't need to convince the world right away. She only needed to protect Arthur first. She would find the right time to reveal the truth. Every time she saw Helen walk through the mansion, proud and untouched, Mary reminded herself that lies don't last forever. Deep down, Helen believed she had total control, but she didn't know how far Mary was willing to go for Arthur. The game had changed. Mary was no longer afraid. She had uncovered the source of the manipulation, and now she was ready to fight it. She had nothing to lose and everything to protect. Fear was always with Mary. Every time she passed Helen in the hallway or saw Richard speaking with the medical team, her chest tightened. She knew that one wrong move could cost her everything: her job, her access to Arthur, and maybe even her safety. But she couldn't walk away. Each time doubt crept in, Mary thought of her daughter. She pictured her fragile hands, her fading smile, the moments when she had begged for relief. That memory gave her strength. Mary understood that if she accused Helen without proof, no one would believe her. People would say she was just a bitter maid, or worse, someone trying to scam a rich family. She had to be smart. So, she started documenting everything. Whenever she was alone in a room, she took pictures of documents using an old phone she kept hidden in her drawer. She took notes in a small notebook she tucked inside her uniform pocket. Mary also began collecting small pieces of evidence that others ignored. Empty bottles, used syringes, unusual pills. She kept them hidden in a box inside her closet. If someone found it, she would have no way to explain. But she took the risk. She even wrote down dates and times of every unusual medical visit. She started tracking when Helen visited the house, when nurses came and left, and how Arthur felt afterward. Mary didn't always understand the science, but she recognized the patterns. Arthur would often complain about pain in his stomach or headaches after being given injections. Sometimes he felt dizzy or couldn't sleep. Mary pretended to comfort him, but inside, she was putting the pieces together. She began to realize that Arthur wasn't just being lied to, he was being harmed. Slowly, she began to build a picture of what was really happening. a carefully hidden system of abuse disguised as care. Arthur, without knowing the full truth, became part of Mary's effort to gather information. He often spoke without filters, sharing everything that happened to him because he trusted her completely. "I had another shot today," he would say, "but this one didn't sting like before." Or Helen said, "I need more medicine because my blood is getting bad again." These little comments, innocent as they seemed, were full of clues. Mary listened carefully to every word, often writing down his statements late at night when he was asleep. She never asked him direct questions, not wanting to alarm him or lead him to say something he didn't understand. But the more he shared, the more Mary cried quietly in private. It broke her heart to know he was being poisoned, both emotionally and physically, by the one person who should have protected him. She began to realize that this wasn't just about lies. It was about long-term damage, and it was happening right in front of everyone's eyes. Mary often stood outside Arthur's door after putting him to bed, her hand on the frame, tears in her eyes. She couldn't stop thinking about how her own daughter had died despite all the real treatments, while Arthur was being treated for a sickness he didn't even have. It felt like a cruel twist of fate, but Mary couldn't let the pain turn into hate. Instead, she let it fuel her determination. She thought of herself not just as a housekeeper anymore, but as Arthur's protector. If she didn't act, no one would. The mansion was too quiet, too used to keeping secrets. Everyone played their part, followed orders, and looked the other way. Mary refused to be like them. She knew what true sickness looked like, and this, what Helen was doing, was worse than disease. It was evil in disguise, and it needed to be stopped before it was too late. Still, Mary knew how risky everything had become. Helen was powerful, with deep connections, and a reputation that gave her the freedom to act without being questioned. Richard, blinded by guilt and grief, trusted his mother completely. If Mary were discovered, she'd likely be fired instantly, maybe even arrested for stealing or trespassing. But none of that scared her more than the thought of leaving Arthur alone again. She couldn't imagine walking away, knowing that he would go back to living in lies and fear. That thought gave her the courage to continue, even when she felt afraid. Every day she stayed in the mansion, she walked a tightrope. She smiled in front of the staff, kept her tone soft around Helen, and followed her usual cleaning schedule. But behind the calm face was a woman on a mission, working silently to expose a truth that could shake the entire family from the inside out. Mary no longer cried, just from sadness. Now her tears came from a mixture of pain and determination. She knew she couldn't bring her daughter back, but maybe she could stop another child from losing his life. Arthur was slowly becoming like a son to her, and she wouldn't let him be destroyed. She didn't know exactly when or how she would reveal what she had found, but she was getting closer. Each note, each photo, and each piece of discarded evidence brought her closer to the truth. The more she uncovered, the more focused she became. It wasn't just about exposing Helen, it was about saving Arthur's future. Even if she had to go against a respected doctor and a billionaire, she would do it. Because in her heart, she knew the difference between right and wrong. And for the first time in a long time, Mary felt that her pain had a purpose. She was ready to fight. Tired of waiting and watching Arthur suffer day after day, Mary decided it was time to speak up. She had collected enough evidence, photos, dates, discarded medication labels, and copies of fake test results. Her hands shook slightly as she stood outside Richard's office door. She had rehearsed the conversation in her mind 100 times, but now that the moment was real, fear threatened to hold her back. Still, she knocked and entered. Richard looked up from his desk, surprised to see her standing there so seriously. Mary wasted no time. She placed a folder on his desk and calmly told him that Arthur was not sick, that the treatments were unnecessary, and that someone was lying to him. Richard frowned, his expression changing from confusion to irritation. "What are you talking about?" he asked. "This is a serious accusation." Mary nodded and told him she understood, but she had proof and needed him to look at it with an open mind. At first, Richard refused to believe anything she said. He pushed the folder aside and told her this was nonsense. He accused her of trying to create drama, even hinted that maybe she was trying to scam the family for money or attention. But Mary didn't back down. She asked him to just read the papers. She pointed to one document in particular, an internal test result that had been changed, with 2 different dates and numbers that didn't match. Then she showed him the photos of discarded syringes with unmarked chemicals and the bags of blood she had found hidden in the closet. Still, Richard looked skeptical. He ran his fingers through his hair and said this couldn't be true. "Helen is a doctor," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "She's helped us from the start." But then Mary gently told him to ask Arthur directly what he felt after every injection, every so-called treatment. Richard called Arthur into the room, sitting him on the couch. He asked gently, "When do you usually feel sick?" Arthur looked between his father and Mary, then quietly answered, "Only after the shots. I feel fine before that." Richard's face changed. He didn't speak right away. He looked down, clearly shaken. The boy didn't understand the seriousness of what he had said, but it hit Richard like a punch. Mary stepped back, giving him space to process. Before he could respond, Helen entered the room. She had overheard enough to know what was happening. Calm and composed, she walked in and accused Mary of theft, saying she had broken into private files and tampered with medical equipment. Her tone was sharp, confident. She even claimed Mary was manipulating Arthur to say what she wanted. But Richard, still holding the folder, was no longer so sure. His eyes moved between his mother and Mary. Something inside him was shifting. Helen kept talking, trying to explain that Mary was just a bitter woman projecting her grief, that Arthur's symptoms were real, and that she had acted only out of concern. But her words didn't match the papers in front of Richard or the things Arthur had just said. Mary remained calm, even when Helen raised her voice. She didn't need to yell. She had the truth on her side. Richard finally interrupted, asking Helen why so many documents had different versions, why the treatments had never helped, why Arthur, who was supposed to be dying, had improved the moment some sessions were skipped. Helen tried to deflect, but her usual authority wasn't working anymore. Richard's trust in her was beginning to crumble. Years of control and manipulation were breaking down in minutes. He looked at his son, then back at his mother, and the weight of the truth began to settle. He saw the cracks in the story he had believed for so long. Richard stood up and walked over to the window, silent for a long time. He didn't look at either of them. He just stared out, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. He felt guilt, betrayal, and anger all at once. He thought about the years he had spent cold and distant from his son, thinking he was keeping him alive by trusting the treatments. All that time, he had been enabling something much darker. Helen, the person he had trusted most, had used that trust to build a lie, not just a small lie, but a lie that poisoned a child's life. When he finally turned around, his eyes were tired. He didn't say much. He simply asked Helen to leave the room. Helen looked stunned, but obeyed. Richard then turned to Mary. "Why didn't I see it?" he asked. Mary didn't answer that. She just said softly, "Because you trusted the wrong person." That was all he needed to hear. For the first time, Richard believed her. Not just because of the documents or the conversations, but because of how consistent and calm Mary had been through all of it. She had risked everything to protect a child who wasn't even hers. Meanwhile, Helen, despite her confidence and power, had shown signs of panic when her lies began to fall apart. Richard walked over to Arthur, pulled him into a hug, and sat beside him. The boy leaned into his father's side, not fully understanding what had changed, but sensing it was something big. Mary watched the moment quietly. She knew there was still a lot to be done: legal steps, medical evaluations, exposing the entire scheme. But for now, the most important thing had happened. Richard had chosen to believe in the truth. He had chosen to see his son not as a diagnosis, but as a boy who deserved to live. And most importantly, he had finally chosen to listen. The evidence Mary had gathered over weeks, photographs, medical records, altered test results, and samples of unmarked medication, was finally handed over to the police. Richard personally delivered the folder, accompanied by a statement detailing everything he had learned and witnessed. At the station, detectives took the case seriously from the moment they saw the documents. The fact that the accusations involved a respected doctor made it even more urgent. An investigation was opened immediately. Officers visited the mansion, questioned staff members, and collected remaining samples from the hidden drawers and medical cabinets. It didn't take long before inconsistencies surfaced in Helen's work across several clinics she owned. The authorities discovered that she had used fake patient records to move money, and Arthur's case was only one of many. But what made this case more serious was the emotional and physical harm done to a child. Helen's careful plan, maintained for years, was finally falling apart. The arrest came swiftly. Helen was taken into custody at one of her clinics, where she had been overseeing a shipment of medical supplies. The police arrived with a warrant and a detailed list of charges. She tried to stay calm and act in control, but witnesses later said her hands were shaking. The charges included fraud, medical malpractice, child endangerment, and financial crimes. News of her arrest spread fast. Within hours, her face was all over the media. Once seen as a brilliant and trusted figure in the medical world, Helen was now exposed as the mastermind behind a cruel and complex lie. Her licenses were suspended. Colleagues distanced themselves. Her name was removed from several boards and associations. But for Mary, the real victory wasn't about public shame. It was about justice for Arthur. She had feared this moment, worried it would never come. But now, it had. Helen's power was gone, and the truth was finally winning. Richard had trouble processing everything. Even though he had already begun to accept the truth, watching his mother being arrested was something else entirely. He sat in silence for a long time after receiving the call confirming her detention. He felt a strange mix of anger, confusion, and guilt. All those years, he had believed he was protecting Arthur by following Helen's advice. In reality, he had allowed his son to be trapped in fear and pain. Richard looked back and saw all the moments he had kept his distance from Arthur, thinking he was being strong, when in fact he was being cold. Now he knew that Helen had manipulated him from the beginning, playing on his guilt and fears. Accepting that wasn't easy. It meant admitting that he had failed as a father, but it also gave him a chance to change, to do better. And he was ready. For Arthur, for Mary, and for himself. Mary's life also changed. She was no longer just the quiet housekeeper working in the background. She was now the woman who had stood up against someone powerful and protected a child no one else truly saw. The same people who used to ignore her in the mansion now treated her with respect. But Mary didn't care about attention or praise. What mattered to her was Arthur's safety and happiness. She stayed by his side through every step of the recovery process. Doctors, now working independently from Helen, confirmed that Arthur was healthy. There was no sign of leukemia or any serious condition. Arthur stopped receiving treatments, and for the first time in his life, he could simply be a child. He began spending time outdoors, laughing and exploring things that had once been forbidden to him. Mary watched him with pride and emotion. The little boy who once lived in fear now had a real chance to grow up free. Arthur didn't understand everything that had happened, but he knew things had changed. The house felt lighter, quieter in a good way. There were no more needles, no more strange pills, and no more days spent lying in bed, waiting for side effects to pass. Instead, there were toys, books, and long talks with Mary. He also started spending more time with Richard, who was trying to build a real relationship with his son. At first, it was awkward. Richard didn't know how to act around Arthur, but Mary encouraged both of them. She gave them space, helped when needed, and slowly they began to bond. Richard started reading to him at night and even joined in drawing sessions. Arthur smiled more often and asked fewer questions about treatments. The scars of the past were still there, but the healing had begun. The lie that had controlled his life was over, and with it came the freedom to live fully. The house was not the same anymore. The silence that used to represent sadness was replaced by a quiet sense of hope. Richard made changes, not just in the way he treated Arthur, but in the way he ran the household. Staff were treated more kindly, medical routines were removed, rooms that were once closed became open. But the damage Helen had done couldn't be undone overnight. Trust needed time, relationships needed to be rebuilt. Richard apologized to Mary sincerely, not just once, but many times. He told her that if it weren't for her, Arthur would still be suffering. Mary accepted the apology, but she stayed focused on the future. She remained by Arthur's side, not as an employee, but as family. Together, they started to rebuild what had been broken. The shadows of Helen's ambition were fading. And in their place, a new story was beginning, one built on truth, care, and the courage to do what was right. With Helen behind bars, the atmosphere inside the mansion began to change. The place that once felt cold and lifeless slowly came back to life. There were no more doctors walking through the halls, no more locked doors, no more medications left on tables. Instead, the house was filled with the sound of quiet laughter, footsteps running in the hallways, and the smell of real meals being cooked again. Richard, no longer under his mother's control, started spending more time at home. He wasn't buried in meetings or hiding in his office anymore. He made a real effort to be present. His guilt over the past didn't disappear overnight, but it made him more determined to do better. Every morning, he checked on Arthur, and every evening, he read stories before bed. The routines were new, sometimes awkward, but honest. The mansion wasn't just a building filled with expensive things anymore. It was becoming a real home. Mary stayed. Richard didn't ask her to remain out of obligation. He begged her to. She had proven herself as more than just a housekeeper. She had saved his son's life, uncovered a painful truth, and stood strong when others turned away. To Arthur, she had become a safe presence, someone who never lied to him and never left his side. She helped with meals, played board games, and sat beside him during quiet evenings. Richard gave her a new room in the mansion, larger and more comfortable. But Mary rarely cared about those things. What mattered to her was Arthur. The boy reminded her so much of her daughter, his curiosity, his gentle voice, his sensitive heart. Being around him didn't erase her grief, but it gave her purpose again. Every hug, every smile, every question he asked made her feel useful, needed, and important. And for the first time since her loss, she could say she felt at peace. Arthur adjusted quickly to his new reality. He no longer asked about injections or treatments. Those parts of his life faded, replaced by days at the park, bike rides, puzzles, and learning things most children take for granted. He laughed more. He slept better. He even made a few friends through a local activity group Mary enrolled him in. At first, he was shy, but with time, his confidence grew. Richard and Mary were there for every small step forward, cheering him on, making sure he never felt alone again. Arthur didn't fully understand what had happened, and no one rushed to explain everything. For now, it was enough that he was free. He was no longer a patient. He was just a boy, finally allowed to be himself. Richard sometimes watched him from a distance, amazed at how different his son seemed. And every time Arthur looked back and waved at him, Richard felt something he hadn't felt in years: joy. Richard had changed. He wasn't just trying to fix things with money anymore. He knew now that money couldn't replace time, honesty, or affection. He began to focus on being a real father. He cancelled long business trips and delegated responsibilities he used to handle alone. He made time to eat with Arthur and walk in the garden with him and Mary. His cold attitude from the past faded. He apologized often, not just with words, but with actions. He asked Mary for advice when he didn't know how to handle something. He listened more than he spoke. Slowly, he earned back his son's trust. Richard also realized how much he had relied on his mother's control, believing she always knew best. Now he understood that love required effort and presence, not control or guilt. He often said thank you to Mary, not out of habit, but because he truly meant it. She had helped him become the father he should have been from the start. For Mary, the future held a different meaning now. The pain of losing her daughter never left, but it didn't control her anymore. She had found a new kind of family in Richard and Arthur. What started as a job had become a life filled with meaning. She no longer cried herself to sleep or woke up feeling lost. Arthur filled a space in her heart that had been empty for so long. Richard treated her with respect, not just as staff, but as someone important to the family. She had a voice in the house, a say in decisions, and a seat at the table. People in the neighborhood began to notice the change in the family. Whispers of scandal were replaced with stories of healing. Mary remained humble, always focused on what mattered most, keeping Arthur safe and happy. She had faced evil and fear, and now she chose to live with kindness and strength. The mansion, once silent and heavy, now had light in every corner. Music played in the afternoons. Arthur's drawings covered the walls of his room. Richard even turned one of the study rooms into a playroom, something he would have never done before. They celebrated birthdays, decorated for holidays, and made new memories to replace the painful ones. Life was far from perfect, but it was real. Richard finally understood that his wealth wasn't his greatest asset. It wasn't the cars, the house, or the bank accounts. It was the family he was learning to build. The connection between him, his son, and Mary was stronger than anything he had known. And Arthur, no longer a quiet, confused boy trapped in medical lies, was growing into a joyful child full of energy and dreams. The lies were gone, the damage was healing, and for the first time the future felt bright, not because of money but because of love. Finally, we've reached the end of this story. I'm extremely happy that you've made it this far. Thank you very much for watching. Comment below what you thought and what was the best or worst part. Don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.